All right, good morning, good evening, good night. Welcome into the Nifty Q Show. I'm interviewing founders, leaders, and awesome builders in the NFT and blockchain industry. Today, I'm sitting with John Hillis, co-founder of Creator Cabins, co-founder and caretaker of Creator Cabins and CabinDAO, to talk building decentralized cities, organizing DAOs, their first property in Austin, Texas, the future of work, and much more. John, I'm happy to sit in here with you today. You're an actual builder, like physically building things there in near outside Austin, Texas. How are you doing today, my man?
That's right. Yeah, I'm doing great. I live out here on site at the cabins. We're about 45 minutes outside of Austin, Texas. And yeah, I just can't imagine a better dream job where I get to help build virtual communities and also a physical one here.
Yeah, I'm excited that you took my request here. You posted on Twitter right after I DM'd you. You said people should learn how to DM so that you get a response. Now, break that down for me. What about my message just said, "Hey, I need to be on this guy's show"?
Yeah, I think I'm always excited to respond to cold DMs. I think that's one of the magical parts about Twitter and the internet more broadly is that people are just very accessible if you are willing to provide the right context and help people understand, that you're not just copy pasting some random thing to 100 people and you're really, who they are, what they're about, you've done your research, you've done your homework, and you're reaching out with a specific ask. If you make it really easy for people to say yes, then you're going to get a lot more yeses.
Absolutely, man. And I'm glad you said yes here. We're going to talk like decentralized cities. It gets my hair tingling a little bit when we're talking decentralized cities in the future of how people will organize. It's kind of like, I feel like almost a fetish of people who like are post apocalyptic that we're going to like all get into these Bitcoin citadels and do these things. So is that what you mean by building decentralized cities when you have that on the website?
It's really not. I hear you there, and I think there's a kernel of truth to that. I think many of us draw inspiration from, great science fiction like Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash or, Diamond Age with this idea of these sort of post nation state structures, and I think we are headed towards that world. But I wouldn't call myself. An apocalyptic thinker or a hardcore libertarian or anything like that. I think what I'm much more interested in is how we start to take these amazing, flourishing online communities and manifest them in the real world.
Yeah, the other discussion I kind of wanted to have that we'll make our way into later in the episode is this idea that we're kind of coming out of COVID and kind of getting back into the IRL world in the meat space. And you guys are super positioned to at least push that narrative, right? That we should be less about finding or interacting with our tribe on Discord and more about interacting with our tribe in real life. Is that kind of the
Yeah.
narrative there?
Yeah, I think it's a yes and, right? I think that if you look at the kind of things that the internet's good for and the things that the real world is good for, they're good for very different things. And I think the path forward here, the sort of post-COVID world, is going to be a hybrid world, but not in the way that people usually talk about hybrid. So when people usually talk about hybrid, in like some corporate sense, they're talking about like, oh, we're going to do 3 days a week at home and 2 days a week in the office, and some people on Zoom and some people in person. That is like the worst of all worlds. And there's another form of hybrid that we're real believers in, which is you can live and work anywhere in the world you want. And, 95% of the time, you have total autonomy and flexibility about your geographic location. And then, maybe 5 or 10% of the time, you want to get together with people IRL and have the really deep, meaningful connections, the liminal time and space that allows for a creativity and a productivity and a focus on big picture and strategy that is not really possible over, an hour long, highly agendaed, structured Zoom call. And so I think like you need both. And if you look at the people who figured this out better than anyone, it's online daters, right? If you are looking for a life partner, there's probably no more highly motivated group of person than people looking for life partners to like try to find the right people. And what they do is, now if you look at a chart of how everyone meets, right, it's like online, apps have like gone through the roof. Everything else is falling off a cliff, but you don't stay that way. You tap into this incredibly broad, limitless, pool of people online. You find the right matches, you find the right people, you find your tribe, your community, and then you get together IRL. And you got to have both in order to have really, I think, fulfilling community-based experiences.
I'm interested in this piece too, that's on your website where you're talking about communities not needing to be in one place, right? Like cities can be connected, by different variables that maybe we don't think about normally when we're looking at just geography. So this is going to be a deep one, man. I literally was putting together the question board and I was like, where do I start with this? Where do I take this? But let's start with like the traditional start to a podcast. Who are you? Where do you come from? How did you find yourself in blockchain?
Yeah. I feel so fortunate to be living a life where I never could have predicted how this would kind of all come together, but there's so many strands of my life that feel like they've helped bring me to this place. And I think that's true of a lot of people working in Web3. I get the sense that, for many of us, we didn't choose Web3. Web3 chose us, and we were on these sort of dependent paths. And so for me, there's a lot of ways you can trace that back over time, whether that's my earliest childhood interests in architecture and in wanting to build new forms of like off-grid sustainable housing. I was really excited about and interested in earthships as a kid. And you can trace that through to college, where I spent a lot of time studying complex adaptive systems and agent-based models, and strategies for these bottom-up ways to overcome collective action problems. And I thought it was just this like weird esoteric corner of political science and economic academia. And it turned out that even though I didn't have the words at the time, it was basically DAOs. You can trace it to my interest in online communities and the time I spent throughout my middle and high school years in weird corners of the internet, whether that was early Reddit, where I was like a very active lurker and then member, or Dig, some of these other ones, or even weirder, more esoteric things like the Science Olympiad message board, where as a very nerdy middle school kid, I spent a lot of time hanging out with other science nerds. And those experiences were tremendously formative. Out of college, the first company I ended up working on was a startup that was intended to be a sort of like proto version of a token gated community. It was like a subscription based thing that you had to pay, and there was like a bonding curve, even though, again, I didn't really have the words for that at the time. Turned out to be the total wrong time in like
Yeah.
2013 to build that kind of thing. Nobody wanted that. Everybody was just still on Facebook. But now it's really come back around. And so, I think there are all of these threads. I was fortunate to have, like many people, my path into crypto is kind of a classic story where I had a college roommate who was, buying drugs on Silk Road and showed me Silk Road and Bitcoin. Classic situation for the degens out there. And, I bought a little bit of Bitcoin as soon as I had my first job and had a little bit of money, and then got some Ethereum right after the initial sort of crowd sale. And at the time, I thought the technology was fascinating, but it was kind of speculative. There wasn't a lot you could really do. And what I think has really changed in the past year, or maybe a little bit longer, is that now there are these incredible use cases for these things, and use cases that are not just about making money, which I don't find terribly exciting, but are about building community, building governance structures, building this shared culture together. And that's what really got me excited about starting to use these tools in new ways.
This is such a cool conversation because you had all these DAO-like experiences as like a young person. You were almost like training to be where you are now, not even knowing it, which I think is cool because there are a lot of people who are listening to this now who are into NFTs. This is like a primarily NFT-based show, but having the conversation about DAOs is important because they're going to be making their way and already are in the NFT space. So How can you kind of bridge someone's understanding of like those Web 2 experiences you had and what that means in a DAO now? Like how would you get
Right.
that analogy across to someone who's new?
Yeah, so I have the fortune of getting to do this actually with some frequency. One of my kind of side gigs is that I'm an executive in residence at Reforge, which is an online community and set of courses for Web2 product people, and has an incredible group of these Web2 product leaders that I get to be the guy with all the weird Web3 ideas, and it's led to some really interesting conversations and debates with people that are very deeply ingrained in the current systems, but want to understand and want to learn more. And the way that I typically talk about it is first of all that I think there's basically three primary primitives of Web3, which is DeFi, NFTs, and DAOs. And that you can think of those primitives. You can think of DeFi as being the money layer, NFTs as being like the kind of culture and art layer, and DAOs as being the governance and organization layer. And I think they're all important. I've gravitated pretty heavily to DAOs given my interests and background. But I think typically like one of those three is where somebody's going to plug in. And then, I think a lot of people's skepticism comes from the fact that it feels like, it's still this like speculative magic internet money. And what I really try to help people understand is that that's just the tip of the iceberg, and that, there's so much more below the surface about how these tools of self-sovereign autonomous ownership of digital assets can be used for coordination, for governance, for bringing people together. And I think like that's where we're just starting to scratch the surface.
And you're doing that in real time. I mean, right before the episode, the viewers at home, we weren't live yet, but John took me literally outside and showed me where he's in the cabin right now that he's talking about building.
Yeah.
When you go to CabinDAO and the cabin Creator Cabin's website, like you are on location building. So take me to that origin story of how you kind of got into DAOs and then how you founded this awesome organization that you're currently leading.
Yeah, thank you. The story here is that I was very burnt out in Web 2. I was leading product teams at Instacart, was a director of product focused on the gig, essentially the gig side of the marketplace, the shoppers and the people, shopping on behalf of customers. And I realized that the gig economy was not going to work out in sort of some of the extremely optimistic ways that we hoped it would. But there was still a lot of kernel of goodness there in terms of the ability to create autonomous, independent earning opportunities online in a pretty permissionless way for people. And what I came around to was the idea that these declining transaction costs were changing the nature of the firm. There's this Nobel Prize winning economics paper from the 70s from a guy named Ronald Coase called The Nature of the Firm. And it's about the fact that companies really only exist because there's transaction costs between people to get stuff done. And so if those transaction costs get lowered by software, then the prediction would be that companies won't exist in the same form, at least. And we started seeing this play out in Web 2 with the gig economy, and I think we're continuing to see it play out in Web 3 with DAOs. And the process, from getting from Instacart to here was that I was burnt out, quit my job, and basically decided to spend all of my time thinking about what the sort of concepts of frictionless independent online work would look like in the context of knowledge work, because I felt like less commodified labor was the path towards creating ownership structures and sort of structures of gig work that were better for the people doing the work. And that turned into the, sort of creator economy. Started a group called the Creator Co-op, where we started exploring what it looked like to have these decentralized organizational structures for these types of workers. And then simultaneously had decided that I was going to kind of like swear off working in tech and, was burnt out and just wanted to go build a cabin in the woods. And so I did that, went back to the area where I grew up, and I grew up in Austin, Texas, and came out here to the Hill Country, which had always been a deeply meaningful place for me. Just beautiful nature, and started building a cabin and invited my, buddies from the Creator Co-op out. And then sitting around a campfire, late one night with that first group out here, we started talking crypto, started talking about these new things called DAOs, the new mirror crowdfunding tool, and how we could start to use some of these tools to create interesting opportunities to bring independent online creators together and give them the liminal time and space to create. And that's how the DAO was born.
Yeah, this is a super heady conversation. We made our way down the rabbit hole really quick, but just to TLDR, what you said was basically that, as we grow into the internet age and this continues, you essentially are talking about that disintermediation of the company. Like I use the taxi service as a great one because people can kind of have that analogy. It's like, let's have Uber instead of taxi services. Let's have all, like these disintermediated, decentralized systems set up to take the place of that company is kind of what you're getting at, just to kind of put a bow on it.
Yeah, I think so. So one way to think about this is sort of an evolution from companies to gig structures to DAOs. And if you think about the declining transaction costs, right? If you when you agree to work for a company, you have to like sign all sorts of paperwork and have an agreement for what you're going to do, and they give you a salary. And then in exchange for that, you like have these structures where you're kind of inside the bubble of this company, and so you can have lower transaction costs for individual interactions. But if the transaction cost goes down, if now think about an Uber driver opens up the app and can immediately one click accept a unit of work, and they know exactly how much they're going to get paid for this specific sort of atomic unit of work with very low transaction costs, that starts to erode the reason that companies exist. And now you get this network of sort of independent agents, operators. But the problem with that is that there's still this, sort of, it's like this halfway solution where you still have this centralized thing at the core that owns all the infrastructure and is controlling it and can cut people off and this sort of thing. And so DAOs are sort of a next evolution of this, where now, particularly in the context of knowledge work and more complicated forms of work that can't be atomized in this way, where you need people to like really work together to coordinate. What DAOs give us is a method through which that coordination can happen in a trustless environment, among internet strangers.
And so with this move to DAOs, and I definitely want you to break down those details there and go a little bit in depth on the tooling and how this allows people to coordinate efficiently. But before that, just a lightning question. Spectrum wise, how far can we make it down this decentralized work system? Are you envisioning a future where like there's only 3 big companies and everything else is just completely, decentralized when it comes to, coordinating around getting stuff done?
Yeah, I have no idea. I think a thing about technologies like this is that it's very easy to overestimate them on short time horizons and underestimate them on long time horizons. I think there's a Bill Gates quote about this. And the basic idea is that like on a 1 year time horizon, everybody's going to be like extremely optimistic about what these things can achieve. But actually it happened because it's happening exponentially, and we tend to think linearly. We overestimate for the early period of time, but then once you really hit the inflection point on that exponential curve, then things happen way faster than people expect in maybe like a decade. And so look, companies have been around for a long time. They're pretty well optimized technology, and so I don't think they all get like immediately displaced overnight. But I do think that over the next decade, we see pretty fundamental changes in the way that these, sort of centralized organizations get superseded by a new organizational structure that is worse at some things and much better at other things, sort of in a classic like Clay Christensen, innovator's dilemma sense. You have like these new disruptive technologies, as he would say, which is now like a totally bastardized word, but in the original sense, it means they're things that are actually like a lot worse at a lot of things because they're totally unoptimized systems, but they have a couple advantages that if you really lean into those advantages, they create much better long-term outcomes, and I think that's what we're going to see with DAOs.
Yeah, and I want to get into that piece about tooling and how this allows now that step further. But you guys are going like 18 steps further with this kind of spectrum and saying we're not just going to decentralize companies and make it so like the people interact, in a business sense, in a decentralized way. We want to do this with cities. We think cities
Yeah.
can be this in total, which we'll get there.
Yes.
But we're still kind of in that DAO piece, in that DAO conversation. So how does, in that Uber example, how would a DAO get set up in this example? And then what is the benefit that it provides after disintermediating the company Uber, essentially?
Yeah. Yeah. So we don't, first of all, I think we have to caveat everything by saying, it's obviously early. We're just seeing like the initial forms of these systems. And so we're all still trying to figure this out, right? We need to understand the principles that make these organizations work effectively in a way that I don't think people really know how to do yet. And there's actually a lot of good, history to look at here that I think we can learn from. And we shouldn't pretend like this is some brand new, structure that has never existed before. There are elements of it that are new and dependent on new technologies, but there are also elements of it that date back, many thousands of years to some of like my earliest influences about this stuff were like Eleanor Ostrom's work on irrigation systems and the emergence of agriculture in the dank river valleys of Mesopotamia, through these like decentralized organizations for managing irrigation structures. So there's actually a lot of good history here to look at to understand, how to do these things effectively. But we need to relearn a lot of this in the context of modern tools. And I think
why those two
yeah, sorry, go
examples
ahead.
there? Like you're talking about like
Yeah,
agriculture specifically with the irrigation systems
yeah,
and things like that. Were you just drawn to that just from your like love of outdoors, and how is that like the
that's a good
best?
question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, some of this is probably like has some randomness of like personal path dependence associated with it. I've never seen a better example, than sort of Eleanor Ostrom's work on irrigation systems to describe the origins and the sort of like example over many thousands of years of how these decentralized systems can work. It's still the case today that there are irrigation systems that are locally managed in a bottom-up way using these decentralized structures that tend to outperform centralized irrigation and water management structures in developing countries in particular. And so I think that's one of the best examples. I wrote this like long essay called A Brief History of Centralized States and Decentralized Cities or something like that. And, I actually think you can trace examples like this through all of the major periods of Western civilization and sort of through the major epics, whether that's sort of the early emergence of civilization, the development of Greek city-states, the development of medieval towns, or sort of the modern development of the United States and the origins of the sort of northeastern towns that became the core of the like revolutionary movement. What you see in all of these examples is some new technology, typically coordination technology, whether that's irrigation structures or alphabets or writing, printing press. These new coordination technologies allow for people to start building decentralized cities. And this was like the big shock to me looking at this history is like, oh, this decentralized city idea, which I thought I helped come up with actually is like a thing that people have been doing for many thousands of years in different contexts. And then, as those cities start to proliferate using these new coordination technologies, they start running into scaling problems. They federate. Eventually, some like more efficient centralized structure comes along and topples them, and then the centralized structure ends up kind of like overgrowing and falling apart. And I think it's certainly a lot of the, late stage capitalism and late stage democracy, memes really rhyme with the degree to which these centralized institutions in the past have fallen apart, and new coordination technologies sort of always tend to emerge to allow this next phase of decentralized institution building. I think that's what we're dealing with right now.
I don't want to get like too pie in the sky, too philosophical, but
Yeah.
do you see like crypto and blockchain almost in that timeline of like you see that scale up of that fatness of, and how can I even say this, that fat stage of capitalism,
Yeah.
and the reaction being blockchain, the reaction being DAOs, the reaction being people are going more back into tribes, if even if that tribe is
Yeah.
on the internet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, I don't know why these new coordination technologies always seem to emerge in the moments where they're most needed, where the centralized structures are failing. But it does seem to happen consistently across history. And, I think it's a combination of the internet, and blockchains, and these are all new coordination and communication technologies that are unlocking the ability for us to return to some of these bottom-up decentralized roots.
That was just a blast right there. That combo right there was a blast. Hopefully you guys at home are having a good time. Guys, we are on YouTube right now. Drop some questions in the chat. I see some questions there from the people who are live viewing. We're also on Spotify and Apple Podcast after the fact. So big shout out to you guys listening on audio. So John, break down what a decentralized city means to you, like a definition. You did that. You mentioned it a couple times, saying that these actually
Yeah.
existed, early in the millennia and things like this. So break down a decentralized city the way you see it, and then let's talk about founding creator cabins and what you guys are doing.
Sure. So, I think the easiest way to think about a decentralized city is that cities are built around the dominant technology of the era. And for the last century or so, most of the cities that we know and live in today were built around cars. And cars are so prevalent in the structure of cities. And I think that cities in the next century will be built around the new dominant technologies of the era, the internet and blockchains. And what if you think about this sort of crucial thing that makes the internet different from previous city dominating technologies is that the internet is not bound to geography. It's not all in one place. And so I think the big idea here, that hopefully decentralized cities help unlock for people, is the idea that at the core, cities are really about shared culture, shared economy, shared governance structures, and they don't actually all have to be in the same place. And so a decentralized city is a structure through which you can have many geographic locations, these independent nodes or neighborhoods in a network, that can all have their own local culture and governance and economic models, but can also be a part of this larger mesh network of locations all over the world where there is a shared sense of culture and a shared sense of governance and values and community and economy across these locations. And as an individual, you could live entirely in one of these networks where you can travel around and be anywhere in the world you want and still feel like you're at home in your city.
I don't know where to go from there. I have like 15 different questions. I mean, when you're talking about coordinating between cities, so you're saying a decentralized city. So, I'm always looking at it when it comes to history from like the anthropological perspective of like we're still kind of monkeys. We still have that in our brain. How does someone feel connected or doesn't form their own kind of group where they are geographically and still feel connected to this decentralized city you're talking about? Do you guys take that into consideration?
Yeah, I think this is the magic of the internet, right? Like I think many of us are currently feeling like we've been able to find deeper connections in the vast group of humans on the internet and find our little corner, right, where we can find our tribe. And that those connections and that culture, the shared memes, the shared understanding, is in many ways just as deep as or deeper than connections that we can make in our local neighborhood. And sort of returning to the previous part of the conversation about remote work and when it makes sense to be IRL and when it makes sense to be virtual. I think it's all about people sort of coming together and building these initial shared cultures online, but then wanting to get together with those people IRL, where you can have the deep bandwidth and the liminal time and space of being physically present with each other. And I think that is what people ultimately want for like a full sense of fulfillment that you're not going to get over a Zoom call. So what this looks like in practice is that I think every community ends up having its own vibe, right? Its own sort of culture, its own like local autonomous governance and organizational structures, but that there's also a shared sense of culture, a shared sense of memes and values and economy, across nodes in the network. And so one like very tangible example of how this could work, I'm holding up my cabin passport, which is a card with a chip embedded in it. This chip holds a public-private key pair, so it's a wallet, and so it can hold NFT visas on this passport that allow you to travel around the network. And in the future, perhaps it unlocks doors. It can be verified as like meaning that you're a member of different nodes or different sort of tribes within the network, and can be a way for people to both feel very locally connected to the place that they're in and also feel like they're a part of this broad global community.
Yeah, and it lets you in the Citadel, right? It gets you in
Yeah,
as a
exactly.
passport.
Yeah,
I want to get into what you guys are doing right now on that 28 acre piece of plot that you're sitting on currently, that you guys are building
yeah,
on. I looked at some of the pictures on Twitter as I was kind of scrolling, and it was really cool to see you guys IRL just building instead of kind of philosophizing on this is what's on our roadmap, right? You guys are actually doing
right.
this in practice. Before I
Yeah,
get there, and I feel like I'm doing this a lot on this episode, you mentioned society's building around the biggest technology of the era, and the cars were really this technological piece that we've been building around. I feel like nothing says that more than like sports stadiums. You see sports stadiums
mm,
nowadays, those could be like the the structure around a sports stadium, or like the environment, should be really awesome, but what you see is just miles of cars. You
parking
see just
lots. Yeah.
parking lots, and that, from an archaeological perspective, or an architecture perspective there. Do you feel like we'll get to the point one day where we'll go back to actually building awesome cities, or are we just gonna have parking lots for
Yeah.
10 years, for like hundreds of years here?
No, we're going to get rid of the parking lots. You're exactly right. That's a perfect example. And you walk through a city, right? So even in Austin, I went back to my parents' house recently and was driving down their street and realized after living out here where everything is very human scaled, where we have 3 foot wide trails, connecting houses together, and all the space is usable by humans and surrounded by nature. And then you go back to a city and you drive down a street and you're just like, oh my God, there's all the houses are like really far away from each other, actually. There's all this space in between for cars to drive and cars to park and cars to park in parking, driveways and
Yeah.
parking lots. It's just like, it's insane. If you, there's a member of our core team named Phil Levin, who started a bunch of incredible co-living communities in the Bay Area, and was on the founding team at Cul-de-sac, which is trying to build this car-free city in Arizona. And what Phil really realized is that if we want to build high density housing, all you have to do is get rid of cars. You don't have to build crazy skyscrapers to get high density housing, because cars and the space that cars operate in and take up and park in is like 2/3 of cities. And so if you
Mm.
just get rid of that, and replace that with stuff that is at a human scale, and additional housing and additional amenities for people and parks and these sorts of things, there's just a tremendous amount of wasted space. So yeah, I think that in the next century we're going to see a very different relationship between our built environment and cars.
That was a great breakdown. I appreciate you indulging me on that topic there. It's cool to see the Twitter profiles, like the architecture Twitter profiles that have like top down shots of like old cities that still exist in
Yes.
Europe, where they're like, oh my god, that's like super intricate and awesome, and then you see like grids for the U.S.
Yep, yep. Or there's even some similar pictures I've seen where people will overlay a single highway interchange, like the big roundabouts that you have to get on to go on highways. They'll take like one of those and then they'll take like Venice, and they'll overlay like a chunk of Venice on a single highway overpass. It's like you can fit the kind of main walkable area of a lot of these old European cities in the space that it takes just to have a freaking highway interchange.
That is amazing. Yeah. Yeah. All right. And I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we're going to stay on Creator Cabins. Tell me what you're
Cool.
building out there in Austin, Texas, man. Like show like from the ground up, from the start, like let's hear that origin story of and where you guys are at today with this plot of land.
Sure. So like I mentioned, I was kind of burnt out on my Web 2 job. Wanted to just ride off into the sunset, get away from it all, and go build a cabin in the woods and live out in nature with my wife. And we succeeded at the first part of that. We built the cabin in the woods. We failed terribly at the getting away from it all, but in the most sort of beautiful possible way, where there's this incredible community out here now. And so basically, what happened is we moved out here. We started building a house, and I had a couple hundred Twitter followers and realized that like if I really wanted to bring this vision to life, I needed to just start like building in public really aggressively. And so literally, right after I moved out here, one of the first things I did was just tweet out like, hey, I'm just going to start building stuff. Like, what should I build? And have like a Twitter poll or something. And people were like, build a fire pit. And I was like, okay, cool. What should I use? Like, I was wandering around Home Depot, literally like tweeting like what materials, and people are like, use local rocks. So the first thing I did is literally just dug a bunch of rocks out of the side of one of the hills and built this lovely, fire pit. And I just kept building things, right? It was like, okay, what should we do next? How about a yoga deck? And then it was like, okay, we're working on this prefabricated shipping container home. Spent a whole lot of time thinking about how to build it and design it specifically for this use case of independent online creators. Ended up building this co-living structure with this big common living area and these private bedroom suites with desks and private bathrooms, so that it would be sort of a perfect fit for groups of people to come together and get to know each other in a co-living environment. Realized that like there was no way this was going to work if we didn't have really good internet. Went to great lengths to build like a 70-foot internet tower, that's beaming in 200 megabits a second from over towards Austin to make sure that we had great bandwidth out here. Built all the infrastructure out, and then through the process of building in public, just started attracting like-minded people who were really excited about this. And I think I really buy into the theory that the internet is great, software is great. That's my background is in software product development, but ultimately we need to get better at actually building real things in the real world again. And if we can do that in a kind of community-led way, then I think that it helps us actually build towards the future that we want to live in.
Yeah, so you have a community there that is building IRL. I'm sure there are also people in your community that aren't, there and aren't ever maybe gonna go and see the actual physical place, but they're contributing, from Web3 and from the internet. How do you continuously like get more people to found? Is the idea to like found this in Maine and in Oregon, and how do you go about that process of maybe bringing people both to your location and to found different nodes in other areas?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the goal. That's exactly it. And I think that we have this wonderful saying in Cabin that the DAO provides. And one of the beautiful things about DAOs and about internet communities is the way in which if you put out the bat signal, if you put out the big exciting vision of the future that people want to be a part of, the right people show up to help build that. And that includes people who want to build stuff, on site here. That includes people who want to start their own nodes, people who already have, their own cabin in the woods and maybe their own sort of creator community built around that, who are a perfect fit to plug into the network. And so one of the things that we are constantly doing is we're on the lookout for other vibe-aligned groups that want to do this thing, and that includes everything from a co-living community that owns a property in Big Sur to a couple that has been building their own creator retreat for the past nearly decade in the Eastern Sierras, a group that is currently trying to buy a big property in Colorado, a very crypto native person who lives in Costa Rica and is building out a node there. People that were interested in buying a castle in Lisbon, and all of these people just show up and come together, and we can serve as sort of a Schelling point for helping them understand what it actually takes to build something like this, and help any way we can to enable them to build their own nodes.
I feel like in 20 years that there's not going to be this stigma. But right now, what do you tell somebody that thinks this is like hippie nation or like a cult? Because I'm sure there are people out there right now listening. They're like, this is not going to go. We've seen this in the 60s right, where people are trying to build their own areas. And maybe it did or it didn't work. I didn't follow. I wasn't alive back then. Yeah. But what do you tell these people?
Mostly it didn't work.
Yeah, mostly.
Yeah, totally. It's a great book. Like, I don't know if you or anyone listening has seen the Netflix show Wild Wild Country. It's like a great example of how this goes horribly wrong. And I think we have to be really humble. We have to have a lot of humility about the fact that we're certainly not the first people to try to build these sort of intentional communities, and the vast majority of them either stay very small and local, or grow in these like really unhealthy, typically very centralized ways that end up blowing up in everyone's face. And so I think we are aware of that, and the way what I think is necessary to avoid that outcome is to be very intentional about the values of decentralization and the sort of values of our community that we're bringing to this, and treating this like the most important thing I think I can do is basically figure out how to kill myself off, because like the last thing that a community like this needs is founders who end up in these like very centralized roles where they have a tremendous amount of power that they're exerting over the community. And I think the structure of decentralized organizations and the values of DAOs are set up in a way that can provide us a different set of outcomes, because they don't have this sort of like corrupting power mentality, ideally, that some of these organizations that have failed have had in the past.
This is a cool talk. You have such a holistic view on kind of growing organizations. Where did these organizations in the 60s, 70s go wrong, essentially? I think you mentioned on some of those, like creating one centralized figure that was almost like a god, essentially, and it became a cult, right? But totally. Where did they go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. Like a literal cult of personality, right, is the most common failure mode of these things. Wild Wild Country is an incredibly informative example. You have literally like a guru type figure, who ends up like driving around fancy cars, and like then I won't spoil the story. Go watch the Netflix series, but like turns into some really messed up stuff, because that power corrupts. And I think that's like a pretty common failure mode here. There are other failure modes, right? There's people who like want to create these sort of, like you said, hippie sort of idealistic communes. That tends to also fail because like these communal structures are not the path forward. So those are kind of the two sides of the spectrum, either like over centralization or over decentralization. And I think what DAOs, both of course physical DAOs like us, and also just DAOs in general, are going to have to navigate over the next decade, is developing the organizational structures that are heterarchical, that have the right types of leadership roles and sort of localized nodes of people that can operate autonomously and do things, and power structures that are good for the long-term nature of the community's survival that avoid these sort of two extremes that we've seen fail.
I'm again getting stuck on where I want to take this conversation, but DAO ownership
Yeah,
is another
yeah,
piece that I really want to touch on. You mentioned, we're talking about kind of community building, and ownership within that is super important. A lot of these DAOs have tokens, so that's kind of a thing I want to throw at you. Is there like a going to be an ERC20 token that's associated with this project, and is there an ability to buy it on Uniswap and figure out how that all kind of works out? How do you kind of
yep.
look at tokens within your DAO setup in this kind of building of a decentralized city?
Yeah, so we actually had a token before we had a DAO. We originally, started out with this idea of crowdfunding creator residencies at the Cabin, which we did via an ERC20 called Cabin. The point of which was so that we could have a governance mechanism for the contributors to the crowdfund to vote on which residents could come out to the cabins. And the intent was not to make a DAO or really to make like a token with like economic value so much as a governance structure for a community. And it has now evolved into, a sort of new version of the token that is listed on Uniswap so that new people can join the community. It also is how we pay out bounties within the DAO, for people who want to contribute and get involved, so that they can have a stake in what we're building. And so it's been pretty magical to watch the seed of this like governance token for a residency program evolve into this economy of the DAO.
How do you deal with it becoming maybe not? How do I explain this? Maybe the hurdle becomes too big, or the barrier to entry becomes too large when a token maybe gets absorbently priced, where you kind of set an entry price of like, hey, you can enter if you have one token, and maybe that's 10 cents one day, and maybe in a year that's $1,000, and you want to be open to
Right.
everybody. How do you look at that from a
Yeah.
economical perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we, first and foremost, like one of the things we really value as a community is being accessible and, relatively permissionless in terms of membership. So, um, the threshold is one token, right, to join our community, to get in the Discord, to be able to vote, and we want to keep that barrier to entry really low, and we also want to make sure that that's something that we can keep doing on an ongoing basis. So one of the kind of like tokenomics hot takes that we have as a DAO, is that we have an inflationary token. We have a token that we specially designed so that the DAO can print more of it, with the idea that what we very intentionally want to essentially devalue past contributors who are not currently continuing to contribute, and create space for new people to be able to come in in a really accessible way.
That's a great point there. Kind of devaluing people who kind of fall off, right? Because that's another point of having a city. I think you mentioned Wild Wild West country, or Wild Wild country. A lot of that happened when they got to a certain point where people weren't contributing to the system, and they were kind of leeching off
Right.
what everybody else was building, which is a whole nother community building problem you guys are going to have to deal with as you
Totally.
scale. So tell me like what the roadmap is here for the Texas plot you guys got. Like what are you guys doing next with both CabinDAO and the plot that you're currently sitting on?
Yeah, so we got together as a core team at the end of 21, and put together our 2022 roadmap. It was a sort of perfect example of like dog fooding our own product and the value of coming together IRL for these like deep strategic conversations with the core team. And what we came to was that 2022 for us is all about building an embassy for DAOs. We think that the most valuable thing we can do is bring together groups of people with shared context into this multiplayer mode. And the way that we do that is by running DAO operator residencies. We have a group of DAO leaders and operators from across the ecosystem that are out here right now for one of our residency programs, and we bring in facilitated sessions and guest speakers, and try to create really deep opportunities for connections across the ecosystem. We also offer retreats for DAOs. So if you have a core team that wants to come out have your own sort of IRL time together with your remote team, you can do that. And then we also do build weeks. So, we literally have groups of people from the DAO come out and build physical things. A couple of weeks ago, we had a group from the DAO out here that built a big stone patio and fire pit and pergola structure in just a couple of days. And I think we really want to push the ball forward on what DAOs can physically build together. And that was done in a decentralized way, led by a 22-year-old Canadian architecture student, named Charlie, who ran that whole project out here. So that's what we're doing at Node 0 here in the Hill Country. And then we're also starting to expand other nodes. So we've identified, a couple of really vibe-aligned groups who I mentioned some of earlier, who have similar properties and operations going on. And we want to be really intentional about onboarding people who are going to be great adds to the community and just slowly start to expand the network.
How do you continue to scale and have the coordination piece and also kill yourself off? Because as you grow, right? As you grow, you're gonna need to be able to say, hey, like we have to do this together. Or I mean, technically, they could build their own. They could build CabinDAO too. So how do you hold on to that like piece as you guys scale to like 30 and 40 different node locations?
Right. Yeah, it's important. It's a huge question. I think like I try to find ways to kill myself off in little ways every day, right? Like I try to hand off responsibilities to other people within the DAOs, decentralize the leadership of the organization. A great example of this is the Build Week I was just mentioning. Charlie, 22-year-old architecture student came out here. I had just gotten back from ETH Denver, had COVID that week, as did my co-founder, Zach. And so we could not really help lead the project. And Charlie brought out this group of people from across the DAO, and they were totally autonomous in their creation of this amazing structure on the property. And I think had a tremendous time together too, building the community. And it was so beautiful to see that I'm not needed for that. Like the community can do that on its own.
That's amazing, man. I really like what you guys are kind of leaning into, which is bringing together people who maybe need some help with their DAO, right? They like come in and have your team kind of sit down. It's almost like an incubator of sorts. Like I could see an incubator in your guys' future if that's not already in the works. Quick shout out to Seed Club. I really like what they're doing from their kind of standpoint. So what is the application here? If I've got a DAO team and I'm looking to, come out to Austin, sounds like a great time. Is there a absorbent cost to this? Do you guys cover that? Or how does this all work if I'm interested in kind of participating?
Yeah. So if you're a DAO team that wants to come out here for a retreat, you can email retreats@creatorcabins.com. And we do have a fee for coming out. I believe the current fee is 1 ETH for a week with, to bring your group out and use the property and the resources available. And we also have the DAO operator residencies. If you're, a core contributor or a leader within a DAO and you want to get plugged into that, we have an application that you can find at creators.mira.xyz. We also have ways to get involved with the DAO, whether you're somebody who wants to come build physical things on the property or, write and do research and create content about how to DAO. Our media guild is a great fit. If you're a product person or an engineer, we're building these passports and these other ways that we're both using products internally and then also creating tools for other DAOs. And so, we have a home for anybody that is excited about this solar punk future that we're trying to build.
So, do you say solar punk? I
Yeah.
love it, man. Break that down. What's solar? That's solar punk terminology. The first time I heard it.
Yeah, I do have to wrap up here in a minute, but
No
this is a
worries.
good place to end. So, cyberpunk is the kind of terminology for the Neil Stephenson style sci-fi future where you kind of have like this disintegration of like the kind of current institutional structures and some replacements for it. And solarpunk says, hey, there's actually like a brighter version of this future. There's an optimistic version of this future where we use these new coordination tools available to us to overcome collective action problems, to solve climate change, to build these new IRL communities that are deeply integrated with nature that we want to live in. And that's the escape hatch. That's where
So,
we're headed and what we're trying to build.
dude, I love that, man. What a great term. I'll be using that more and more. John Hillis
Yeah,
here, caretaker of CabinDAO of Creator Cabins. Definitely want to get out to Austin, man. I'm a big Cowboy fan, so I travel to Dallas all the time, but I need to get to Austin
amazing.
here relatively shortly. Thank you so much for coming on today. Any last words for the viewers or listeners out there as we sign off here?
No, this was a really wonderful conversation. Appreciate you having me on, and yeah, anybody who's interested in these ideas, come hang out in our Discord. You can check us out on Twitter at Creator Cabins, and we'd love to talk with you more about it and see how we can help you, realize your part of this future we're all excited about building.
Amazing stuff. All right, Solar Punks. You guys get out of here. This was the Nifty Q Show. I will see you guys hopefully tomorrow. But we are here every Wednesday, Thursday for podcasts with awesome people like John. So, John, thanks again, man. Hope to see you soon.
Awesome.